Right now, somewhere in the world, someone is pouring milk into their coffee without giving it a second thought. Cow's milk specifically has become so deeply embedded into a huge number of modern diets that it barely registers as unusual at all. But step back for a moment, and the whole thing starts to look remarkably strange. Humans are the only species on the planet that continues drinking milk well past infancy. And not even our own species' milk, but the milk of an entirely different animal. So why exactly did this happen? Why do humans drink cow's milk, or goat's milk, or sheep's milk, but not, say, dog's milk, or cat's milk, or the milk of most other mammals we regularly interact with? Let's dig into this properly, because the answer involves biology, geography, and an evolutionary twist that's honestly one of the more interesting, surprisingly recent stories in all of human history. Let's start with the most basic biological fact worth understanding first, because it explains a huge amount of what follows. Mammals, as a defining feature of the entire biological class, produce milk specifically to feed their own offspring during infancy. This is true across the board, from mice to whales to humans. But here's the detail that tends to surprise people. Most mammals, humans included, naturally lose the ability to properly digest milk once they're weaned off it during early childhood. This happens because digesting milk requires a specific enzyme called lactase, which breaks down lactose, the primary sugar found in milk, into simpler sugars the body can actually absorb and use. In most mammals, lactase production naturally declines sharply after infancy, since there's no ongoing evolutionary reason for an animal to keep digesting milk once it's no longer nursing. This means, from a purely biological standpoint, adult humans shouldn't be able to properly digest milk at all. And for most of human history, and for a huge percentage of the global population even today, that's exactly the case. Lactose intolerance, the inability to properly digest milk sugar in adulthood, reflects the biologically expected ancestral default for adult mammals, humans very much included, rather than some kind of medical abnormality or dietary sensitivity, in the way it's sometimes casually described today. What actually requires explanation isn't why some people can't digest milk as adults, but rather why a meaningful portion of the human population somehow can. Let's talk about that specific evolutionary twist, because it's honestly one of the more compelling examples of rapid human evolution driven directly by cultural and dietary practice. At some point, after humans began domesticating animals like cattle, goats, and sheep, roughly somewhere in the range of the last 10,000 years depending on the specific population and region, certain human groups began regularly consuming the milk from these newly domesticated animals. This would have provided a valuable, reliable new source of nutrition, fat, protein, and calories, particularly useful in populations dealing with unpredictable or seasonal food availability. Within these specific populations, a genetic mutation that allowed lactase production to continue into adulthood rather than shutting down after early childhood, the way it does in most mammals, would have provided a meaningful nutritional advantage. Individuals carrying this mutation could continue digesting and benefiting from milk throughout their entire lives, gaining access to a valuable, calorie-dense food source that individuals without the mutation couldn't properly digest or benefit from nearly as well. Over successive generations, in populations where dairy farming became a consistent, reliable part of the local food supply, this mutation spread rapidly through the population via natural selection, since individuals carrying it had a genuine survival and reproductive advantage in environments where milk represented a significant, reliable nutritional resource. This is honestly one of the clearest, most well-documented examples of human evolution happening in direct, measurable response to a specific cultural practice, in this case, animal domestication and dairy farming, rather than purely in response to some external environmental pressure like climate or terrain. Culture and biology, in this specific case, evolved together, each reinforcing the other, cultural practice creating the selective pressure that then drove the biological adaptation, which in turn made the cultural practice even more nutritionally valuable and worth continuing. It's worth explaining how researchers actually pieced together this specific evolutionary timeline, because it involves a remarkably clever combination of genetic and archaeological detective work. Geneticists studying modern human DNA identified the specific genetic mutations responsible for lactase persistence, and by comparing how these mutations are distributed across different modern populations, alongside analyzing ancient DNA extracted from skeletal remains found at various archaeological sites, Researchers have been able to estimate roughly when and where this mutation first appeared and began spreading through specific populations. Interestingly, ancient DNA analysis has revealed that lactase persistence genes were still relatively rare even several thousand years after dairy farming had already become well established in certain regions, suggesting the genetic adaptation actually lagged considerably behind the cultural practice of dairy farming itself, rather than the two developing in perfect, immediate lockstep together. This lag is worth sitting with for a moment, because it means ancient dairy farming populations were likely consuming milk products for a considerable stretch of time before most individuals within those populations could actually digest raw milk comfortably as adults. This detail connects to another important piece of the puzzle worth exploring specifically: fermented dairy products, including early forms of cheese and yogurt. Fermentation naturally breaks down a significant portion of the lactose in milk, converting it into other compounds during the fermentation process, which means fermented dairy products are generally considerably easier to digest for someone without lactase persistence compared to drinking raw, unfermented milk directly. Archaeological evidence, including chemical residue found on ancient pottery fragments, suggests early dairy farming populations were producing and consuming fermented dairy products like early cheese remarkably early in the overall history of dairy farming, likely well before widespread lactase persistence had actually spread through these populations genetically. This detail adds a fascinating layer of nuance to the whole story, because it suggests early humans may have essentially worked around their own biological limitations through food processing techniques, long before evolution eventually caught up and provided a genetic solution allowing direct milk consumption without needing that extra fermentation step. Cheesemaking, in this sense, wasn't purely about flavor or food preservation, though it certainly served those purposes too. It may have also functioned as a practical technological workaround for a genuine biological limitation, allowing populations to benefit nutritionally from dairy farming even before the lactase persistence mutation had spread widely enough to make direct milk drinking comfortable for most adults within that population. Let's talk about specific archaeological sites and findings that have helped establish this timeline more precisely, because the physical evidence itself is worth appreciating directly. Researchers examining ancient pottery vessels from various early farming sites across Europe and the Middle East have identified specific chemical signatures, milk fat residues absorbed into the porous ceramic material over thousands of years, that confirm these vessels were regularly used for processing or storing dairy products. Some of these findings push the confirmed use of dairy products back several thousand years earlier than researchers had previously assumed based purely on other lines, demonstrating just how valuable this kind of detailed chemical residue analysis has become for reconstructing ancient dietary practices that left no other obvious physical trace behind. Let's talk about a related and important nuance worth mentioning here too. The degree of lactase persistence and lactose tolerance actually varies somewhat even among individuals from populations with a long dairy farming tradition, and it can also be influenced by factors like gut bacteria composition, meaning the picture isn't quite as simple as a strict genetic binary between people who can fully digest milk and people who can't process it at all. Some individuals without the specific lactase persistence gene variant can still tolerate smaller quantities of dairy reasonably well, particularly when consumed alongside other food, or when consumed in fermented forms like yogurt or aged cheese, where much of the lactose has already been broken down through the fermentation process itself. This adds some helpful nuance to what can otherwise sound like an overly simplistic genetic story, since actual lactose tolerance in any given individual reflects a combination of genetics, gut microbiome composition, and even the specific quantity and form of dairy being consumed, rather than a single, absolute genetic switch that's simply either on or off. Let's talk about geography and genetics a bit more specifically, because lactase persistence, the technical term researchers use for the ability to digest milk into adulthood, isn't evenly distributed across all human populations worldwide. It shows up at notably high rates in populations with long historical traditions of dairy farming, certain populations in Northern Europe, parts of the Middle East, and specific pastoral populations in Africa with long histories of cattle herding, among others. Populations without a comparably long historical tradition of dairy farming and milk consumption, including a large percentage of populations across East Asia, parts of Africa, and indigenous populations in the Americas, generally show considerably lower rates of lactase persistence, meaning lactose intolerance remains the biological norm for the majority of adults within these specific populations. This geographic and genetic variation is worth sitting with because it means the common Western cultural assumption that milk is simply a normal, universally appropriate food for all adult humans reflects a fairly specific, geographically limited evolutionary history, rather than any kind of universal biological baseline applicable to humanity as a whole. From a global, species-wide perspective, being able to comfortably digest milk as an adult is actually the genetic exception, not the rule, even though it happens to be the common pattern within certain historically dairy farming heavy populations that have disproportionately shaped a lot of modern global food culture and dietary assumptions. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Now let's talk about why cows, goats, and sheep specifically became the primary source of milk for human consumption rather than any of the countless other mammal species humans have interacted with throughout history. This comes down to a combination of practical factors related to domestication suitability more broadly. Successfully domesticating an animal for milk production requires several specific conditions to align. The animal needs a temperament suitable for close, regular human handling, without being so aggressive or unpredictable that milking becomes dangerous or impractical on a consistent basis. The animal needs to produce milk in quantities meaningfully beyond what its own offspring require, leaving a genuine, usable surplus available for human consumption. And the animal needs to be practical to keep and breed in significant numbers within a human settlement or pastoral system, requiring a manageable diet, reasonable space requirement, and a breeding cycle compatible with sustained human management. Cattle, goats, and sheep happen to satisfy all of these specific conditions unusually well, which is a big part of why they became the dominant dairy animals across such a wide range of different human cultures and regions, often independently, rather than through any single shared point of origin. Other animals humans have historically domesticated for entirely different purposes. Dogs for hunting and companionship, cats for pest control, horses for transportation and labor, generally don't satisfy this same specific combination of conditions nearly as well. Dogs and cats, for instance, produce comparatively small quantities of milk, nowhere near the surplus needed to make regular milking a practically worthwhile activity for humans. And their milk composition and reproductive cycles aren't especially well suited to the kind of sustained, large-scale dairy production that cattle, goats, and sheep can support. Let's talk about camels and horses too, because they represent an interesting middle case worth mentioning specifically. Certain populations, particularly pastoral and nomadic cultures in Central Asia and parts of the Middle East and North Africa, have historically consumed camel and horse milk as a regular, culturally significant dietary staple, demonstrating that the broader pattern of humans drinking domesticated animal milk certainly wasn't limited exclusively to cattle, goats, and sheep. Camel milk in particular has attracted growing modern scientific interest, since it differs meaningfully in composition from cow's milk, including notably lower lactose content in some cases, which may partly explain why certain populations without strong lactase persistence traditions have nonetheless historically incorporated camel milk into their diet with fewer digestive complications than they might experience with cow's milk specifically. These traditions developed independently in regions where camels or horses represented the most practical, reliably available, domesticated animal suited to local environmental conditions, further reinforcing the broader point that milk consumption patterns across different human cultures developed based heavily on which specific animals were practically available and suitable for domestication and dairy production within that particular regional and environmental context. Fermented horse milk specifically, sometimes known by traditional regional names in Central Asian pastoral cultures, developed into a culturally significant beverage with a mildly alcoholic content resulting from natural fermentation, illustrating yet another example of how a specific regional dairy tradition could develop its own distinct processing method suited to local taste and practical need, entirely independent of the cattle, goat, and sheep dairy traditions dominating other parts of the world. Let's talk about why we don't drink milk from most other mammals more directly now, because beyond the practical domestication and yield issues already discussed, there are some additional relevant factors worth mentioning. Many wild mammal species produce milk with a nutritional composition specifically tailored to their own offspring's particular developmental needs, which can differ considerably from what works well for human nutrition and digestion. Some wild animal milks contain considerably higher fat content, different protein structures, or other compositional differences that make them less practically suitable or in some cases actively difficult for humans to digest comfortably compared to the milk from cattle, goats, and sheep, species whose milk composition happens to align reasonably well with human digestive capability, particularly once lactase persistence entered the picture for certain populations. There's also the simple, practical matter of access and safety involved in attempting to milk a truly wild, undomesticated animal, which represents an entirely different and considerably more dangerous practical challenge compared to milking an animal that's already been selectively bred over many generations specifically for docile, cooperative behavior around humans. Attempting to regularly milk a wild predator or a large, powerful wild herbivore without any history of selective breeding for human-compatible temperament would represent a serious, ongoing physical risk that simply doesn't make practical sense compared to working with already domesticated dairy animals specifically bred over countless generations to tolerate this kind of close, repeated human handling. It's worth pausing to note that humans aren't entirely alone in occasionally consuming milk from other species, even if we're unusually consistent and deliberate about it. Certain domesticated cats and dogs will readily drink cow's milk if offered, though this isn't a natural behavior they'd encounter in the wild, and many actually lack sufficient lactase to digest it comfortably as adults, sometimes experiencing digestive upset as a result, similar to the lactose intolerance experienced by a large percentage of adult humans. There are also occasional documented instances in the wild of one species nursing from another under unusual circumstances, typically involving orphaned young being informally adopted and nursed by a female of a different but closely related species. But these remain rare, largely opportunistic exceptions rather than anything resembling the deliberate, sustained, large-scale cross-species milk consumption humans have built entire agricultural and culinary systems around. In this specific sense, humans really do stand apart from the rest of the animal kingdom, not just in occasionally sampling another species' milk under unusual circumstances, but in deliberately domesticating other species specifically to produce milk on an ongoing, reliable basis as a structured part of our regular diet. Let's talk about pasteurization and food safety too, because this represents an important, relatively modern development that shaped how milk consumption actually became safe and practical on a large scale, well beyond the biological and cultural factors already discussed regarding who can comfortably digest milk in the first place. Raw, unpasteurized milk carries genuine, well-documented risk of transmitting various dangerous pathogens, and before the development of reliable pasteurization techniques in the 19th century, milk consumption carried meaningfully higher health risks than it does today, a practical safety concern layered on top of everything already discussed regarding digestion and lactase persistence. The development of pasteurization, a heating process specifically designed to kill harmful bacteria without significantly damaging the milk's nutritional value or taste, represents a major turning point in making large-scale, safe milk consumption and distribution practical for large modern populations, well beyond what would have been safely achievable relying purely on traditional, small-scale, immediate consumption dairy practices common throughout most of earlier human history. Now let's talk about the modern picture a bit more directly, because milk consumption patterns and cultural attitudes toward dairy have shifted considerably even within relatively recent history. Dairy farming and milk consumption became particularly deeply embedded in certain Western cultural and dietary traditions, partly reflecting the genetic legacy of lactase persistence common in populations with long dairy farming history, and partly reflecting more recent economic, agricultural, and marketing factors that further reinforced milk's cultural status as a standard dietary staple within these specific societies. Meanwhile, in populations without this same genetic legacy of widespread lactase persistence, traditional diets historically developed around other primary nutritional sources entirely, without milk playing anywhere near the same central dietary role it came to occupy in certain Western food cultures specifically. This detail is worth appreciating because it highlights something important about how much of what feels like a universal, common-sense dietary norm, milk is a normal, healthy part of everyone's diet, actually reflects a fairly specific cultural and genetic history, rather than any kind of universal biological truth applicable equally to all human populations regardless of ancestry or regional dietary tradition, a nuance that often gets lost in broad, one-size-fits-all nutritional advice presented as though it applied identically to everyone everywhere. What counts as a completely normal, unremarkable dietary staple in one cultural context can represent a seriously uncomfortable or even actively harmful dietary choice in another, depending heavily on that specific population's particular genetic history regarding lactase persistence. Let's zoom out and pull all of these different threads together, because the full answer to why humans drink other animals' milk, and specifically why cattle, goats, and sheep in particular, turns out to be considerably more layered than a simple, single explanation could ever fully capture. It starts with basic mammalian biology. Milk exists specifically to nourish an animal's own offspring, and adult mammals generally lose the ability to properly digest it once weaned, humans included. It continues with a truly remarkable evolutionary development. Certain human populations evolving lactase persistence, specifically in response to the cultural practice of dairy farming, creating a rare and powerful example of culture and biology evolving together in direct response to each other. And it's further shaped by practical domestication considerations, cattle, goats, and sheep happening to satisfy a very specific combination of temperament, milk yield, and manageability that made them particularly well suited to sustained human dairy farming across a wide range of independently developing cultures and regions. So the next time you pour milk into your coffee or reach for a glass at breakfast, it's worth remembering that you're participating in a remarkably unusual behavior within the broader animal kingdom. Consuming milk from an entirely different species well into adulthood, made biologically possible only through a specific, relatively recent evolutionary adaptation that a meaningful portion of the global human population doesn't actually share. What feels like the most ordinary, unremarkable part of a typical modern diet is actually the product of an unusually specific evolutionary and cultural history, one that unfolded very differently depending on exactly which human population your own ancestors happened to belong to. It's also worth acknowledging that lactase persistence research remains an active, ongoing area of scientific study, with researchers continuing to identify additional genetic variants and refine understanding of exactly how and when this trait spread through different populations. New archaeological sites and improved ancient DNA extraction techniques continue to push back or refine the specific timelines discussed throughout this topic, meaning the detailed picture of exactly when and where lactase persistence first emerged and spread will likely continue getting sharper and more precise as research methods keep improving ahead. Which leaves an interesting thought worth sitting with. If something as seemingly basic and universal as drinking milk actually reflects a fairly recent, geographically specific evolutionary adaptation rather than some ancient, universal human trait, what other dietary habits that feel completely normal and unremarkable to you might actually be resting on a similarly specific, comparatively recent evolutionary or cultural foundation that doesn't apply nearly as universally as it might seem from the inside, quietly shaped by whichever particular corner of human history your own ancestors happened to occupy?